Hey, it's Oliver Bruce, and welcome to the Unlock, previously known as Success is in the Mind. I'm a UK entrepreneur, angel investor, and neurodivergent founder, and I recently exited my first business, which I scaled from my university halls into a multi-million-dollar agency with no backing, no funding, just grit, mistakes, and determination. I want to pass on some of the lessons that I've learned, the barriers that I had to overcome, and the challenges that I'm still coming up against today. This podcast doesn't grow by itself, it grows with you. If you could possibly share this with friends, family, colleagues, anybody you're in business with, somebody that you think might find this useful, I would be greatly appreciative. Anyway, let's get into it. Brilliant. So Simon, original dragon, Sushi fame, rock and roll star, so to speak. Thanks for joining us on the show. I'm fascinated about the journey because it wasn't all Japanese cuisine for the majority of your life, was it? It was Rod Stewart and rock and roll for a period and then a big divorce halfway through. So if we could just dial back.
That and a whole lot more. It's a roller coaster. It sure was.
Well, maybe we can double click into, I guess, the earlier part of your career where you were building sets and running around the world essentially with all these, the great and good, if you will, from a rock and roll perspective. How did you get into that world and what was the kind of reason that you decided that was the place that you wanted to start off in?
It was a rocky start. And I left school at 16, left Marlborough at 16 with 2 O-levels, GCSEs. And, after a bit, I needed a job, and I was 18 and I wasn't doing very much, love and peace in those days. And I bought a couple of newspapers, and one of them was The Stage, and it had an advert in the back for a theatre stage manager. And I went up and I got the job. No experience at all. You wouldn't get that these days. And I was in the theatre and I loved it. And, suddenly I was, doing the curtains and setting the thing out. And I understood how theatre worked a bit. And then rock and roll came along. And, that was my sort of first love, was music in those days. And I got a job. I went to one of the very, very early lighting companies who were doing rock shows. The Rolling Stones and Jethro Tull and the Moody Blues. And they said, yep, if you know your stage left from your stage right, here's a job. And I went off to Italy, actually, and did my first gig. And I was in seventh heaven. I couldn't believe that I had a job on the road with a rock and roll band, which is my sort of dream. And it all went on from there. And eventually I became a stage designer, actually. I used to tell the bands that they should be doing big shows like Busby Berkeley did for the movies in the 1920s. And I went, no, this is rock and roll, and never the twain shall meet. And of course, eventually they did. I got a break with them, first the Moody Blues and then Rod Stewart, and I became a stage designer, and it just happened that way. We weren't running around having parties. I went from a sort of, English upper middle class background to becoming, really the working class of where the pop stars was the upper class, if you like. And so that was hard work. It was real hard graft. And we were, as a sort of tribe of people in the early days of rock shows, putting on sort of the beginnings of spectacles, we were really into showbiz. That's what we were into. So I think that training, and certainly all the design side, I learned to draw and to get things built, and I had an imagination, which I guess I got from not having the imagination educated out of me at school, and I think that did really set me up very well for when I eventually started Sushi, 20 years later, because I often sort of thought, restaurants are every bit as much show business. They have rehearsals and tryouts, first nights, and the runs and all of that stuff, and very, very similar to doing rock shows in many ways. And so I think it did set me up both as a designer, and by that time I'd been in all sorts of businesses, so I understood the business side of it and the contractual side and all of that. But yes, I think it set me up very well.
And in terms of that upper middle class upbringing and the lack, I guess, of O-levels, now GCSEs, how did your parents feel that you kind of left school maybe for not the career that they maybe wanted you to have, whatever that might have been, sitting in some corporate world? You obviously didn't do that. You didn't have the grades that maybe they wanted you to have. What was their take, I guess, on your schooling and education career?
Well, I grew up in Singapore, in old Singapore. My father was in the army, Brigadier Woodroffe, Indian Cavalry Association. And so, those are my formative years. And then we came back to live in England. And I think it was quite a big readjustment for my parents. And we were the poor relations in an extended family, which it may have been upper middle class, my mum would have said, but it was, we weren't rich, certainly not by those standards. So I think that sort of was a bit of a kernel in my oyster, a bit of grit in my oyster that I wanted to be one of those. I think when I left school at 16, I think my dad and my dad has just got divorced. So the money was tight. Honestly, I think for my father, it was just out of his ken. He just didn't, it was so sort of, you know, beyond what he imagined. However, he did save a great deal of money by not having to pay the school fees. So that might have helped. He was just marrying another woman. So it wasn't all great. And I think my mother, she was really, really out of her depth, and she didn't know how to help, and she hadn't lived in England for years, so she didn't really have any connections. So they didn't actually, I mean, God bless them, they didn't really guide me into a career. So I was left sort of thinking, where do I go? And that's why I bought the stage newspaper and got into first of all, the theatre, and then rock and roll from there.
So you kind of, I guess, muddled through in the first, I guess, third of your life, so to speak, to a point where you did have a brilliant time, you did get married, but then everything kind of toppled over at the age of 40. Now, just talk to me about how and why that happened, and that inflection point that you kind of went through at the age of 40 to start what you are now known for, which is Yo Sushi and the sort of Yo group, if you will.
I fell off at several points. I fell off after a Live Aid in 1985, which was, I'm sure none of your listeners have ever had that thought, but I remember suddenly that rock and roll business was grown up, and the big, properly trained designers were coming onto my patch. And I remember thinking, I've got to get out of this business before I get found out. And when I look back now, I'm very, pleased with what I did in those days. And then I was in the television business, selling television rights, because I knew the managers of all the groups. And rock and roll MTV had just come along, and recorded concert shows were coming along. So that was the next thing. And then I got into extreme sports films before Red Bull and extreme sports got big, and I was going to do that. And that could have been a career. And that could have been actually a pretty good career. But again, I fell off the wagon there. Not fell off the wagon, but fell off the precipice, if you like. And I married a girl when I was in the television business. I had made out that I was much bigger deal than I was. A bit of a show off. Met her in Cannes at one of the television festivals, and she's a very good friend of mine today. So we're close. But that lasted for a couple of years, and we had a child, and that did throw me to my knees, actually. I mean, that was divorce. They say divorce takes 10 years out of your life, and it certainly really threw me to my knees. And then I was in the wilderness, and it was out of that I went off actually to live in Chamonix in the French Alps, because I'd always been a climber, bit of a skier, not very good skier, but I was always been a climber and a sailor and extreme sports and all of that. I wonder why. And extreme personality. And I thought, I'm just going to live a simple life. I've had it with trying to be highfalutin. And after 3 years in the Alps, my father died, left me a Vauxhall Astra. I remember I used to drive down there, had enough money to buy a little flat. I was going to rent it out and sleep on somebody's floor just to earn a living. So it was at that level.
Yeah.
And then I thought, no, I'm going to have a go at doing something. I've got to do something. I've got it in me. I still had that creative gene. And I came back to England and started looking at all sorts of things I was going to do. Indoor climbing walls was the big thing I was going to do. I even thought of starting a removals business and things like that.
I thought about doing that. I think there's
ice cream business, like Duncan Bannatyne did.
Yeah. You made a lot of money in ice cream.
Yeah, I did. It's true. And I talked to him about it many times. And so and then I think you've read the book, so you know that story. But I thought, I'm going to phone up all the people I'm most scared of, and I did. And I started making calls, and one of them was a guy called Mr. Uehara, who was a Japanese television producer who produced the Japanese equivalent of Top of the Pops in those days. and has always been a sort of distant character. I don't know if he really liked me or whatever. And I called him up a few years later, and he was just so nice to me. And I said, I'm looking for a new project. He said, well, you're very capable, Simon. I was like, God, I didn't know you thought that. You know how it is. You don't know. You always suspect that people that think the worst of you, perhaps. Yeah. And he took me out to lunch that week, and we were sitting having sushi. A real treat for me because I was living, thinking about twice about breaking into a fiver, no dates, money running out. And he said, "What you should do, Simon, is a conveyor belt sushi bar." And at that moment, it was in my imagination. It was like sort of, when I was a kid and I had, the Hornby 00 train set. And I used to set it up on the dining room table at breakfast and have the marmalade go around on it. I thought, I know, that's exactly what I wanted to do. And that's how I imagined it. I had this before the internet, so there's no research you could do. And that's when I went out and did the research, and I ended up in Japan and I saw these things and I thought, wow. What I really thought is, wow, I hope nobody else who knows something about restaurants has done this, because I think this could really work. In Japan, they were just like low-cost cafes. And I wanted to reinvent it and bring it back as a high-class deal, which is what I did 2 years later.
Because you said in the book that you can't do market research in a market that doesn't exist. And I guess in the UK, it kind of didn't exist at the time. So is that the reason that you went out to Japan to look at what was going on?
I remember coming back from Japan, and Pret a Manger had just opened their first 2 stores. And in one corner of Pret a Manger, there was a tiny bit of sushi. And other than that, it was just very, very expensive Japanese places. But I'd lived in Los Angeles, where sushi had really taken off, in Hollywood. And I used to absolutely love it. Go there and drink sushi and sake and beer. I just thought, this is amazing. And that was my market research, really, because I thought, if I think it's that amazing and it's that popular in America, and generally whatever happens in America comes to England 5 years later, which is what we always used to say in those days, probably the same today, probably 2 years later, I thought that's good enough for me. And as you say, if I'd said, do you want to eat raw fish off conveyor belts with robots serving the drinks? Then people aren't exactly going to say, what is this guy on about?
So it just sounds like a really bad fishing trip when you get to Heathrow Terminal 5 and you've got some fish in a suitcase going around the conveyor. It's not exactly the most appealing image. And I guess the reason that, you were backed to grow Sushi back in the day was, I guess, somewhat in part because you faked it until you kind of made it. You made it sound like Honda and Sony were behind the business, were investing in the business, when the reality is Honda had given you a delivery bike. Now, if I'd listened to the story that you said earlier on about how you were somewhat faking it to make it in the world of rock and roll and indeed television, and making up stories to, go out with a girl, so to speak, do you think that fake it, make it culture for entrepreneurs is so important? And at what point does it kind of need to stop because you're just lying?
I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, my idea was always say yes, that you say yes and then figure out a way of doing it. So I suppose that is fake it to make it, or act as if, or whatever you call it. But building confidence is the thing. And confidence is very attractive in somebody. I mean, it just from doing this podcast, when you're confident talking like we are in front of the camera and lots and lots of people watching you, and you feel comfortable with that, you can't imagine what it was like when you couldn't. But I'm sure I'd be surprised if you hadn't, when you first started, had a beating heart and a dry mouth and all of that. I remember when I first started public speaking, I had all of that. And, you have to fake it a bit to do it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think when I started, I used to say that we'd worked with Vodafone. Now, we'd never worked with Vodafone. We've never worked with Vodafone, but the reason I said that is because they were big enough for no one to ever find out whether we had or we hadn't. It's not as if you're going to go to the head of marketing and go, have you worked with these guys? Because they're not going to know, right? So there was an element of that back in the day when I started, whatever it was, 10 or 11 years ago. And, you talk about those sleepless nights, those dry mouths and that trepidation. And you must have had exactly that for the first week when you opened Yo Sushi, because no one came through the door within the first week, right? You'd raised this money, you'd opened this amazing sushi restaurant in Soho, but nobody was coming. And then the second week, there were queues around the block. Just talk to me about that process as to how, you bootstrapped this really, you launched it and no one came. And then word of mouth was kind of the reality as to how and what grew Yo Sushi. There wasn't a marketing budget. You didn't have paid social. You didn't do out of home. People just said this stuff is good. And then queues formed. Just talk to me about that process.
Yeah, it was pre-internet. And what we actually did was that Mark Norton, who had designed the logo, who's a rock and roll album cover designer, only guy ever to have done, apart from Andy Warhol, to have done 2 Rolling Stones album covers. He put this great big, we were in Poland Street in Soho. It was a big sort of 30-meter frontage, glass window frontage, and he covered it in paper but printed it at highfalutin shops so that it was all orange, and it had some random words like Mackie and Kirin and robot and conveyor. And people in Soho, when it was a backwater of Soho, but people would still be walking past, but everybody going, "What is this place? What is it?" And we wouldn't let anybody see inside. And all the workmen were sworn to secrecy, not to open the door, not to tell anybody what it was going on. So it caused there was a bit of talk. And one day, actually, January 22nd, 1997, we took the paper down. And actually that night we had a launch party and we invited a load of people, and it was a busy thing. But the next day the paper was down and people were walking past on their way to work, and they were looked in through the window and they could see these robotic stainless steel trolleys going past and conveyor belts going round and chefs in there. And they go, and people are coming up, "What is this place? Is this a factory?" And nobody came in because it was absolutely terrifying to go in. You didn't know what you were going into. Was it going to cost a fortune or nothing, or what the hell is this thing? We'd sort of come and have a look if you like. What is it? So that happened, and people really didn't come in, and I was really worried. I mean, I thought people must come in eventually, but it's such an unknown world that there was no precedent for it. And we got through the first week, and all the staff were saying, "Why is nobody coming in here?" And the second Saturday, we had a general manager called Bruce Isaacs who had helped me. He was very good at startups, and he used to come down. He came downstairs to my little office downstairs, and he said, just went like this, he signaled to me, and I came upstairs, and there was a queue down the block. It was unbelievable. I mean, I think it was one of the best feelings I ever had in my life, and I've been on stages and I've been all of that stuff, but it was just such a relief. And that queue lasted for 5 years. It was an incredible thing. It was a very, very, we'd had a hit record. It was a very, very successful thing. And it was pre-internet. Word of mouth had gone out, and people had said it was, Tony Blair had just got into power. It was Britpop, Oasis were going to Downing Street. So was I. And I'd arrived just at the right moment. The timing was superb. And I remember Julian Metcalf actually coming in. I don't know how he got in, but he got in on our opening party, and he's the guy who started Pret a Manger, and later he started Itsu, which was a competitor to us. And he came in and gave me a sort of silver Tiffany good luck charm, and said, "Look, here, this is for you, and lots of respect to you." But he said, "I'm sick as a pig because I'm going to start the same thing as you. It's called Itsu, and everybody's going to think I copied you." And I said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." But secretly, I sort of punched the air, thinking, "Great, I pulled that one off. That got lucky."
Hey guys, sorry for interrupting the podcast, but I thought you might find this useful. If, like me, you found that one of the biggest headaches when running a business is managing money across different tools, currencies, and expenses, then I think I've got the solution for you. Incard is built to fix this headache. Incard is a new financial platform designed specifically for high-growth modern businesses. It gives you multi-currency accounts, connected banking, and smart spend management all in one place. The really cool part is the rewards. With InCard, you earn up to 2% cash back on things that you're probably already spending money on, like advertising, SaaS tools, and travel. Every time you spend, you generate points and you redeem them instantly for cash directly in the platform. So if you're building or scaling an online business and you want a smarter way to manage your finances, check out InCard using the link in the description. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this. Let's get back to the episode. And you mentioned in your book actually that you obviously started this around the age of 40, and that should be some a piece of inspiration for founders that are 25 or younger, or 30 or younger, or 40 or younger, or even 40 or over, because so many people think that they're not sure when to start. Right, is the real point here, and they think they get to a point in their life where they're just too old to start. But as I said, starting at 40 is not what most founders, first-time startup entrepreneurs do. They will start a lot younger than that. So, what piece of advice have you got for those individuals, no matter where they are in their life, to start a business, to just take that leap? Why did you do it then? You had to, I guess. What would you do? What would you say to someone that didn't have that sort of push?
Well, I've had small businesses before that. So I suppose I was an entrepreneur quite young, but never to do something on this scale. And we're lucky with it's an incredible age to live in, because you can start young. And I've often wondered, where would we be now if I had started at 25 and not 45, 20 years earlier? Maybe, I'd always had the ambition that Yo would be another sort of Virgin, and maybe I would have been another Richard Branson, and have lots and lots of things on a massive scale. It's pretty big now, just with the restaurants and the hotels, but not on that scale. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But I think it's amazing that kids can start so young. And of course, you've got much less to lose if you start, because, I've often said, I never met the person who went out to do what they really dreamed of doing, regardless of whether they failed or succeeded. But I met lots of people that looked back and said, I wish I'd tried when I had the chance. And and that is because even if you do fail, you learn so much from a failure. I mean, I saw that in Dragon's Den. People who've actually been in the muck of it, and things haven't worked, are in many ways more investable than the other way around. Certainly venture capitalists like people who've been around and have been through it, and are hungry. Somebody at 40, 45 with a lot of experience, there's a real call to action to get something to happen before you're 50 or 55 and you run out of time.
You're absolutely right about the running out of time piece. And what strikes me is, you're an inspirational chap, period. But what strikes me as super interesting is the fact that you're 74, which I find hard to believe, just to be clear. But also you're posting literally daily across multiple social channels, which people in their teens and their 20s and their 30s are struggling to do. And you're embracing this literally modern era in a way that you are a teenager, you are a Gen Z, you are a Gen Alpha. How are you able to keep up at the point that you are in your life, and why, I guess, Simon?
Well, first of all, I found that writing, which I didn't know I could do. I mean, I didn't know I could do public speaking. And after Dragon's Den, I was all over the world doing public speaking. And those roadies that I'd worked with years and years before, they said, "How the hell are you on stage?" And I loved it, obviously. So yeah, you can learn lots and lots of things. And I learned writing, and I really enjoyed writing. First of all, the book of Yo, which came out 10 years ago, and then now Yo Man. And then I started publicizing, really to publicize Yo Man, and so writing posts and performing in front of television. I'd done lots of TV, so it was a kind of natural habitat for me, being in front of the camera. And I was lucky enough to be born with a nice voice. So, that was, I had a slightly big nose, but a nice voice. So I got a little bit of something.
Is that from that military background, the old brigadier?
But what has been great about social media, and I thought I was doing it to publicize the book, and actually interacting with people. I always swore that if I was ever in the position of being the one whose door was being knocked on when I was knocking up the door, I would always answer people's calls. And so far, I have been able to do it, even though I said to you today on air, if people really want to get through to me, they can. And I'll even speak to them and correspond with them and help them. And it's been enormously surprising what fun it is to talk to people who are starting out. And, if I've got one talent, I've always said that there's a solution to any problem in life and business and everything, if you can find it. And often it's often painful, and it's often to do with the individual seeing things a different way or changing themselves. But I found that is a talent I have with people, is to get to know people, and I know what they should be doing to make the change, to get out of the muck of wherever they're in, and to build something, both as on a practical level of how to build a business, but also on a personal level of how to be the person, rather like the title of your of this podcast, how to become the person who can do those things. And so that has been a real revelation and a pleasure. So I've kept going with it. And yes, I've embraced it all, AI, the whole lot. I always said, never let the old man in.
Well, he certainly isn't.
Never let the old man in. And it's no act. I'm absolutely obsessed. Well, I'm obsessed with living as long as possible, just so I can see these incredible changes that are happening. And I'm totally pro the exploration of space. I'm totally pro AI in every form, and it doesn't scare me. Um, mainly because you cannot reverse culture. You really can't. Even though actually I live in Thailand a lot of the year, and I live in a place that's very old fashioned. So I can escape it a little bit, but the actual world can't escape it. So it's better to embrace it and try and make it really help use it to make a really good world. Although we're in troubled times, out of troubled times come good times and come enormous change, which is which is really, I think, why we're living in troubled times, because we need enormous change, not least in terms of how we govern countries. The idea of having these, without getting too heavy about it, the idea of having sort of 800, 1,000, 2,000 people in a parliament arguing with each other all day, when you look at Singapore or Switzerland, have an executive of 40 people paid very, very well to execute the will of the will of the people. That's executions. Ideas, we've had them since Eve first met Adam, but take it from me, execution's the key. It's not about the principles. So I think as the pendulum sings so far, I think we'll see real change.
Very interesting. And you had political ambitions. We won't go into it in too much depth, but you served, am I right in saying, time in prison as well? And you wanted to look at prison reform as a potential political activation. Just talk to me about that.
I was when I left school, if I have the courage to tell you the story, when I left school, I went to Cambridge Tech ostensibly to do A levels. I sold a bit of hash to a few mates and this, that, and the other on a very, very small scale. And the drug squad arrived one day, and the policeman hiding behind our doors famously said to me, he said, it's a fair cop, Simon. I said, I'm not a criminal. And he said, I think you may be, son. And it was actually very nice. We did it, but I did serve. I was in a young person's jail for 8 weeks, and that curtailed what could have been a very dangerous career, because in my head, I think I was probably planning on doing something along those lines. One thing I learned from being in that place in that short period of time, and I've been into many prisons since just to see how the whole thing works. But, fundamentally, we live in a country where, throw away the key is generally what people think or used to think. I think it's changing now. But what I thought when I was in there is there, but for the grace of God goes anybody who had most of those people's backgrounds. I mean, I should have known better for sure.
Yeah.
I didn't have that. But if you were brought up by, drug addict parents who burnt the furniture just to keep you warm, it's a rational decision to go into crime. And these kids, a lot of them were brought up in crime families and all of that. So, I do think that, to solve the prison overpopulation thing, it has to go back to long-term education. Because a lot of families simply aren't equipped to educate their children and at home. And it's down to schools and the state to help do that and save enormous amounts of money. The economic benefits to not having people whatever that word is, like I can never pronounce, recidivism or whatever it is, of going back to crime. If you can stop that, and trying to change people who are older is very, very hard. But although doable, but trying to change people who are younger is the way to do it. So I'm very sympathetic to that. Prison's not a nice place at all.
I hear you on that, and as you mentioned, that a lot of your life is very serendipitous, and maybe being, as you said, thrown in jail at that young age, did change the course of your career and your life. And looking at you changing the course of other people's lives, whether you like to admit it or not, you were pretty instrumental, I'm sure, in a lot of entrepreneurs' formative years when you were the original, the OG, if you will, Dragon on Dragon's Den, sitting alongside Duncan Ballantyne and the Great and Good. Now, entrepreneurs will have come on that show wanting capital, advice, investment, whatever it was, and you will have had the key or the unlock, if you will, to essentially their future. Now, you mentioned obviously that you're accessible to a lot of these individuals now. Anyone else that wants to reach out to you online can. What was the purpose that you went on to Dragon's Den? Was it to 10x your investment? Was it to help individuals? Was it to raise your profile? What was the thought process there?
Well, going back a couple of years before, 3 years before, suddenly in the post.com, lastminute.com, when all that was happening, that revolution in the mid-90s, entrepreneurs suddenly had gone from being either people in cufflinks and ties in boardrooms or spivs selling something off the back of the lorry, at the other end of the business scale. And we'd become fashionable. And there were lots of TV shows. And I remember doing Mind of a Millionaire, which is actually where I first met Duncan Ballantyne, which is a 3-part series by the BBC, and London's Richest. They got that one wrong. And all sorts of entrepreneurial things. And then The Apprentice came out. And Duncan actually tipped me off about Dragon's Den. He said, you invest your own money on air. And I just sold Sushi for the first time. I sold it 3 times and I made a little bit of money, not a great deal.
That was when you took the first 2 million, was that right?
Yeah, that's right. First 2 million, which I suppose about 5 or 6 million in today's money. And so, and I was a bit embarrassed that it wasn't so much, And anyway, the producers had seen me on these other TV shows and they wanted me to do it. And I said, no, I'm not going to waste my money on doing something like that. And then everybody was talking about this. Everybody in the entrepreneurial world, they were all trying to get on with Dragon. Everyone wanted to be on this TV show because they realized that TV exposure was incredibly good for them and the business and everything, created lots of opportunities. And I was kicking myself. And then one day I got a call from the producers and they said, we just done a pilot of the show and one of the guys hasn't cut the mustard. One of the Dragons hasn't cut the mustard. And would you reconsider, Simon? And I thought, oh yeah, thank you. Step this way. So yes, I did, and that's how I very nearly wasn't on it at all. But it was a magnificent thing to do. I just did the first series, but it took off very, very fast, and partly because I'd done all these other TV shows, and I got to be a little bit famous in that period. And it was very, very useful. And I think, what we've realized today is that getting that publicity in this very, very crowded world, not least sitting on something like this with you one bit at a time, is enormously useful to tell people, look, whatever you do in this world today, the competition is so great that to survive, you've got to be great, 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 great. But you've also got to raise a flag above the parapet, put your head up, be willing to be counted. If you can talk about it and engage people and make them love you and your brand and all of that, it's enormously helpful. And that was on Sushi, that was enormously helpful. It was also a lot of fun doing that first Dragon's Den show, and I met some really interesting people and got exposed to things that I'd never done. And of course, my speaking engagements, all the that went up around the world. I was getting 10, 15 grand a pop and speaking all over the world, and that was pretty cool. That was very exciting.
How exciting. And obviously the Yo Sushi side of things, you say that you sold 3 times. Now, just talk me through that process, because there's entrepreneurs out there that will go, yeah, I can take secondaries when I raise capital. Yes, I can exit totally. But how can I sell it 3 times? What was the process? How did that work for you? Because ultimately you exited for, was it 10 million? You kept a percentage of the business as royalties over the
Yeah,
period of time.
I owned 95% of, as you rightly say, I had those sponsors behind me who had given me some TV sets and an upgrade on an airline and a free bike. And everybody in the world thought that we were a big deal backed by these people. So I got enormous credit. So that is the reason I never needed the angel investors, pre-crowdfunding people, all of that. I never needed the angel investors, and we paid off out of earnings all our debts. So that's how I funded it. And I ended up owning 90% of the company. So we went to venture capitalists, first to one of the big ones in those days, 3i, a big venture capitalist, and then later to a smaller one, primary capital. And we did a deal with them. And I was to get a royalty, 1% of turnover in perpetuity. It was a very small amount in those days. Of course, it's grown to a much, much bigger amount now. And I was getting 2 million quid. And I reduced my shareholding from 90% to 25%. And so that was the first time we sold. Then we actually did a refinancing, which, however that works, is a complicated one. I got another million there. And then that was a bit of smoke and mirrors. I got another million then. And then I sold the rest of my shareholding for another 10 million. So I'd earned 13 million by that time. And that was 25 years ago. And I've earned far more than that from the royalty of 1%. So, I don't know what I've earned out of it, but, probably 40 or 50 million quid out of Sushi. And then we started Yotel. And that is a much, much bigger business than Yo Sushi ever was, and it's growing very fast again now.
Well, this is what I was going to double click into, because I believe Yo Sushi's valuation is what, 500 million, give or take, at the point that you did the
Yo
1%.
Sushi, well, Yo Sushi was actually called Yo Sushi up until that time, but they bought companies around the world who were in the sushi business, and some of them traded as Yo Sushi, and some of them didn't trade as Yo Sushi. So it wasn't just Yo Sushi. And then they sold, believe it or not, about 2 years ago, they sold the entire business to Zensho, which is a big Japanese food company, for, I think it was $850 million.
Okay.
So I would say probably half of that was the valuation of Yo Sushi. So you're probably about right.
Guys, I think I found something that might be super useful for you, and something that we've started using in my businesses. It's called Incard. It's a new financial platform designed specifically for high-growth modern businesses. If you're running a business, you've probably found that one of the biggest headaches is managing money across different tools, currencies, and expenses. Well, Incard gives you multi-currency accounts, connected banking, and smart spend management all in one place. The best part? You earn up to 2% cash back on everyday spend, such as ads, SaaS, and travel, earning you points every time you spend, meaning you can redeem them instantly for cash in the platform. Check out Incard using the link in the description. If you're building or scaling a business and you want a smarter way to manage your finances, I think this is the solution. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Let's get back to the episode. What an exciting journey. And obviously the Yo brand continued even after your Yo Sushi days, because you said you had Yotel, for instance. Now, what makes it a Yo idea? Obviously if you look at Stelios, there's the EasyJet, the Easy Hotel, etc. You mentioned Virgin earlier with Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Virgin Voyages, etc. Are you, or were you, trying to build an empire, a Yo empire, if you will, like those two?
No, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I remember thinking, look, it's amazing that nobody has taken one brand name and done what Virgin have done with it, and indeed what Stelios has done in a very different way. And I don't know anybody who's really done that. And I thought, Yo is in a position to do that as a third thing. So I thought the next thing I'll do is a hotel business. And actually, in the meantime, we'd done Yo Japan, the clothing range, and I'd tried to license Yo, and I went down all sorts of tracks. as Richard Branson did. He was into Coca-Cola and vodka and all of these. He's had more failures than he has successes in that respect. But he's
Rightly so.
obviously done very, very well. But yes, it was exactly what I was trying to do. But the hotel was the one that really took off, and I did that. Eventually, I got a guy called Gerard Green in, who was a young consultant, and he was passionate about hotels, and he fronted it along with me, and actually raised $13 million in Kuwait from a Kuwaiti company, and we opened two hotels, one at Gatwick and one at Heathrow. That was the idea originally, that we'd sell the rooms by the hour in airports and rail hubs, and then it got much bigger. And Jared went to New York, and we did a deal in New York to open nearly 700 rooms in New York, and suddenly we were on a much bigger plane, and then 400 rooms in Singapore, and then the whole thing took off, and Starwood Capital got involved and put $500 million in, and it was a whole number. Very, very exciting to see it all happen.
Well, that's a much bigger journey. And I guess in terms of the second-time founder mentality, albeit you'd had lots of businesses prior to the Yo days, but let's just term it as second time. You obviously potentially put a bit of your own capital into it to sort of front bits, but you raised money as well. How important is it, and why did you put some money in, not all of the money, and then go and raise money? Because a lot of people will look at this and go, just front it yourself, have 100% of it. What was the reason for that?
My model, looking back, and it wasn't particularly planned that way, but is to seed fund something, get it off the ground with my own money, without an investor looking over my shoulder. Do it on a very small scale, which we did at Gatwick and Heathrow, with Yotel. Do it on a very small scale, and then once that's done, then you get the publicity and you become investable. But seed funding still today for a startup, I still do you're lucky to get a Kickstarter or a crowdfunding, and I think people do these days, but certainly in my day we called it the 3 Fs: friends, family, and fools. And certainly you don't, certainly in those days, I think it's the same today. Nobody's going to put money into unless you put everything on the line. And Sushi, I put everything I had. I had £200,000 tied up in my flat, and I put 100% of that on the line, and I actually got matched by a government loan guarantee scheme, which is another 200 grand, and 100 grand's worth of very expensive leasing. And actually opened, that was 500 grand. I opened the £1 million restaurant basically on credit and on belief that we were backed by Sony, Honda, and all the other airlines. So that's actually what happened.
You mentioned that why be a millionaire if you don't like buying things? I guess, do you like buying things, or do you like investing in things and building stuff? Because for me, I quite enjoy buying stocks, investing in businesses and growing something, rather than going out and buying a new pair of shoes. Just sort of talk to me about that saying that you have.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm sort of mean, I mean, I like a nice shirt.
Yeah, I can see it's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. I've always enjoyed dressing up, and I think that's probably pretty good for business as well. Get noticed. Yeah, but no, I don't think I do like buying lots of things. In fact, I don't. I've lived fairly lightly through life, and I don't. I often have thought, I could say it today. I don't think there's anything that I own. There's no sentimental value in any material thing, and there's nothing I own that I'd really mind losing. I wouldn't. I'd be pretty upset if I didn't have any money in the bank. But enough money to live the rest of my life is very, very nice. Thank you very much. Don't let anybody tell you that money doesn't make you happy. It doesn't actually make you happy, but it stops you being unhappy. That's for sure.
I quite like that.
Something along those lines.
No, that's very true. That's very true. And I think what's interesting is that you've tried to do lots of things across the course of your career. Branson's tried to do lots of things across the course of his career, and things haven't worked. Now, you obviously mentioned that AI is happening. We all know that AI is a big revolution that's here, and there's a lot of opportunity for people to be busy fools and to do a lot of stuff and to test a lot of things. Now, when should you focus on the mothership? When should you focus on the here and now? And when should you test, iterate, learn, and do more? Because it strikes me as the fact that you've done a lot of things in a short period of time. Some have worked and some haven't. If you're just hyper-focused on one, would it have been better?
Yeah. I've made that mistake an awful lot of times. And I think that is the right thing to do, is to just absolutely focus on one thing if you can find the right thing. By all means, keep several on the go, keep several balls juggling in the air at the outset. But once you've got something, 100% focus and don't take your eye off the ball.
That makes sense. Is there neurodiversity within you? Have you got some sort of neurological disorder? Is the wrong term?
I did a TV show once where they wanted to go in and figure out if you got one of those. What was it called? What's the dysfunction called where you can't concentrate on something? Dyslexia, which
dyslexia,
lots of entrepreneurs. And I don't have dyslexia. I always felt a bit inadequate for not having dyslexia.
Yes. How are you an entrepreneur if you haven't?
How am I an entrepreneur if I don't have dyslexia? I think it's a slightly fucked up childhood. With a bit of grit in the oyster.
Just a shed load of hash, frankly.
If there's anybody listening who is, a bit, people say they're difficult or a bit chippy or, abrasive or whatever, it ain't a bad thing to have, I tell you. It gets you, if there's a bit of a grit in that oyster, it gets you out doing things and we're going to do it. And I've always had that. And that's been a driver, not caring what people thought. Well, I do care what people think, actually. I'm very sensitive, dear. But I can act over that, and I don't care. And I'll just do it, do what I do. So,
have you ever thought about giving up, Simon? Have you ever thought about just throwing the towel in and going, I actually just can't do this? Send me back to jail.
No, I'm because I've let go and let others, which is what you were talking about and what you were saying. Isn't it difficult to let go? I was so extreme in terms of being a control freak that I really had to learn to let go, and I really got to be good at letting go. And that is what means that I can sit here with quite a few things going on in the world and relatively little stress. And I'm much better with relatively little stress. I can make better decisions. I can help people more. That is the thing. But I think a lot of founders and entrepreneurs find it very hard to let go of their baby. But they're not our babies. You're just borrowing it for a period of time. And you're only here for a period of time as well.
Yeah, it's very true, and you might as well make the most of it whilst you are here. And I guess have you always built businesses to sell? Then I think that's an interesting piece to double click into, because so many people go into companies or businesses or founder life and go, I am going to get to an exit. Now, less than 1% of people ever sell a business, right? Most fail in the first 3 years. Get to 10 years, you're lucky. If you can build it for life, then it's happy days, really. If you can sell it, credit to you. What's your strategy? Build, sell, or build and grow?
I was lucky because we sold fairly early on because we needed the money to expand. And actually, at one point, we didn't tell the venture capitalists when we got in, but we actually needed the money to survive. Even their due diligence didn't quite realize what a hole we were in. It looked good on the outside. So I learned early on that simple lesson, which is it's much better to have a small part of something that's really growing and a big one. And also, I think because I've managed to license the word Yo, the brand of Yo, just to food and beverage, and keep the rest of all other sectors free and clear for myself. It wasn't as if I was giving up my baby Yo. I still had the baby. I was just giving up, I still had the children. I was just giving up one of them to Yo Sushi. So I let that one go and got on with Yotel and the whole of other stuff that I was going to do in those days. So that's the way I cope with what you're talking about. But yes, to plan to exit, I mean, the earlier you get to realizing that, and it's not rocket science to know that you need to plan 3 years out.
Yeah, 100%.
3 years of good accounts and 3 years of well organized, lots of pipelines, so that there's a very big opportunity for the next person coming in. And the day you start a business is a pretty good day. The day I started Yo was pretty good, and the day I sold it was even better.
And everything in between is just ups and downs. I'm a bit disappointed, Simon, that you didn't call your book Yo-Yo: The Up and Down of
Yeah.
entrepreneurial. It's Yo Man. I appreciate it's Yo Man. It's good, but maybe the next iteration can be Yo-Yo: The Story of My Life or something like that.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. The things you didn't read in Yo Man. But actually, Yo Man's, you read it, but it's got a lot about failure. It's got a lot
It
about
does.
things that went wrong, and
It does. It really hit home.
what it felt like to me. And it's I think there's a thing on the back that says it's brutally honest. And I don't know. I just think it's just my story. Call it brutally honest or whatever you like. But yeah, it is, because it's what I wanted to read in the story about somebody doing something like what I've been lucky enough to achieve. Is I want to know what it actually feels like to be in that. I want to know the money is involved. I want to know it straight from the horse's mouth, if you like, without it just being a big ego trip about, which I did this and then next I did that and I'm great. But it wasn't like that for me. It was like, oh, are we going to get through this? Which I think is what most people go through.
They do. It feels properly authentic. I mean, some of the quotes on the back, "He's authentic, the real deal." Tremendous example of risk-taking strategy and tactics. And having read it, the reason I sort of felt more akin to or aligned to that than I have other entrepreneurial books is because it's not sugar-coated, it's not rose-tinted spectacles. There was a lot of mistakes, a lot of buggering up along the way, and you came out on top. And I can somewhat relate to that because having graduated college or school with one GCSE, muddled through, bootstrapped a business, scaled it and sold it. Not my plan didn't go as smoothly as people think. There were a lot of issues along the way. So I think it's a really good read for founders and entrepreneurs to just see what it's like as a boot on the ground, as an individual that is bootstrapping something, if you will. So no, really, really good in that sense. And in terms, Simon, of entrepreneurial advice that you would give to someone that is starting out a business here and now in this climate with AI, with the kind of turmoil that is going on in the world, what would you do if you had your time again?
Well, for a kickoff, most of your listeners are probably more qualified to start a business at this period of their lives and in this period of history than I am. There was a TV show that somebody wanted to do where you got all your money taken away from you and you're given £1,000 and you're told to go off and start something. And I remember thinking about, oh God, I don't know if I could pull that one off. How would you do that? That's, I suppose if it happened, I probably would have said yes, as in say yes.
Yeah.
But my mum always used to say there's never a convenient time to have babies, and I think there's never a convenient time to start businesses.
No, I agree. The saying that I have that I use to underline exactly that point about never a good time is there isn't a good time to start a business, but in business you should have a good time. And I think it's super important if you aren't having a good time and enjoying what you're doing, it ain't really working. If there's doubt, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
For me, I think, in terms of, I guess, how people can reach out to you then, Simon, and how people can follow your journey, buy Yo Man, which is out in shops and online as an audiobook June 4th, 26. How can people reach out to the OG dragon that is?
Well, if you go to yo.co.uk, you can actually connect with me there. There's an email address there. And at Yo Simon Woodroffe is my handle for social media, and I'm available.
Perfect. Look, I've loved every minute of this. It's brilliant. It's a great read. And best of luck with the launch.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate you listening to the podcast. Hopefully you found it useful. For those that want to read up or learn more, head over to my LinkedIn page, Oliver Bruce Online, where you'll find a weekly newsletter called the Brucey Bonus, where we double click into more detail and give you more tips and tricks around how to scale your business. If you want to share this with friends, family, colleagues, business owners, people that are in your circle then might find it useful, I would be super appreciative. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, this does not grow on its own. This grows with you, and we do it for you. So thank you so much for listening, and catch you next time. I mentioned it earlier, but I do think something that you guys might find super useful if you're running a business and managing multiple transactions across multiple platforms is InCard. It's a new financial platform for modern online businesses, giving you guys multi-currency accounts, connected banking, and smart spend management all in one place. You can open up an account in minutes, attach cards for expenses, and earn up to 2% cash back on everyday spend, like ads, SaaS, and travel. Check out InCard using the link in the description.